very warm welcome to this seminar today. It's a great honor to welcome Minister Lidington, Ambassador, and all the audiences here. My name is Mia Horn-Brandsen, and I'm the CEO of SNS. And it's, as I said, a great honor to have Minister Lidington back to SNS, because in 2010, you held your first overseas speech as a newly appointed Europaminister here at SNS. And we then had the opportunity to listen to your views as a new minister on what you saw as the challenges for the European Union, but also for Europe coming out of the crisis as it was at that time, and to build an effective policy and strategy to promote growth and job creation. Today, Europe faces new challenges, one of them being the upcoming referendum in the UK. And we look very much forward to listen to your views on the upcoming elections or referendum, and also what is at stake for UK, for Europe, and also for the world. I will not say more at this time. What I would like to say on practical issue is that we will end this seminar at 9:05 in order to make it possible for the journalists here to have a few minutes with the minister before the end of the session. But now I leave the floor to Per Wisén, Managing Director at the Institute for Financial Research at Stockholm School of Economics, and who will moderate our meeting. You most welcome, Per.
Thank you. And I will be very brief. I will just say two things. The first is, I think some of you are new to this seminar. This seminar series has been going on for a long time. And one of the ideas is that not all of the dialogue and the discussion and the questioning happens up on stage, but it happens sort of in interaction with the audience. So you are very much encouraged not only to ask questions, you can sort of make statements. That's perfectly okay. Say what you feel about things. It doesn't have to be dressed up as a question. People do that sometimes. So please do that. And the second thing, the UK is very important to Sweden. It's our fourth most important export country. We have lots of Swedish companies active in the UK. We send our kids there to go to school or work, and in the EU work. I've particularly in financial markets issues, Swedes and Brits have a tendency to easily find each other somehow. We tend to come to the same conclusions, and so all of this is very important. And a couple of years ago, the FT Financial Times wrote in an editorial that concerning the presidential election in the US that the choice of president in the US is so important to the rest of the world that the rest of the world should have the right to vote for the US election. And applying that FT logic to the referendum in the UK, this is a great concern to all of us. Maybe we should vote in it as well. But once again, much welcome. And Mr. Minister, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak to SNS for the second time. I have now, after 6 years, broken all previous records for longevity as a UK Minister for Europe, and I still am not absolutely certain whether I am supposed to treat this as an unparalleled vote of confidence by my Prime Minister or a cruel and unusual punishment that is almost certainly a breach of the Human Rights Convention. And the issues that we are facing in the referendum campaign are indeed of the utmost importance, not just for the... microphone's not on. Oh, dear. I don't bother with these in the House of Commons. The decision we have to take is of vital importance for the future of my country, but yes, I agree, for the future of Europe as a whole. And I'm going to say a bit about why we are where we are. But so you're in no doubt where I'm coming from on this. I make to make it very clear in case there's anybody who's not been following these events, that I am absolutely sort of committed supporter of David Cameron's campaign to get a convincing vote to remain as members of the European Union. I was with him at the February European Council. I saw how hard he had to work to get the agreement on what are, in my view, a very substantial package of reforms there, and ones that are good for Europe as well as good for the United Kingdom. But let me start with why we are where we are. And I think that there are a number of things I would say. I mean, at the most obvious level, the commitment to a referendum was in the Conservative Party's manifesto at the 2015 general election, and that is what is being now delivered. And I think that if you look at British public opinion, what you saw during the 1990s and the early part of this century was a growing sense of impatience and resentment at the fact that changes were being made without explicit popular consent. We had treaty after treaty, from Maastricht to Nice to Amsterdam to Lisbon, each of which in a different way transferred powers from Parliament, from the British government, to European institutions. And you can argue about whether or not those particular institutional changes were right in policy terms or not. But my point is that those were made, and those treaties were approved by the parliaments of the time in Westminster, but they were not subjected to a public vote. And people felt that this was something on which they ought to have had a say. This really did come to a head at the time of Lisbon, because when the Constitutional Treaty was being discussed, Tony Blair had said that he would put that to a referendum in the UK. And I think Jacques Chirac never really forgave him for making that pledge, because that then led to the French promise for a referendum and the defeat of the Constitutional Treaty in France and the Netherlands in 2005. And then when an edited version of the Constitutional Treaty became the Lisbon Treaty, all of a sudden the referendum pledge no longer applied. And yet next door to us in Ireland, we saw people having not just one referendum, but two. And so there was that sense of resentment, and that was happening at the same time as, particularly under the Blair government, but continuing since then, we've seen a shift in the way the UK does politics to have referendums as a matter of course now on major constitutional issues. It started with the referendums on devolution in Scotland and Wales, a referendum on the peace settlement in Northern Ireland, a referendum on whether to have a directly elected mayor for Greater London, then a referendum under the coalition on whether to change the voting system for the House of Commons, a referendum 2 years ago on whether Scotland should be independent. And so referendums, direct democracy, in the last 15 years has become part of the way that the UK thinks about and does politics, in the way that was just simply not the case before. And so I think that has made a difference to public attitudes and expectations. And I think to some extent that's actually a reflection of one of the changes, one of the many changes that digital technology is bringing to bear on our society and way of living. That in Periclean Athens, you had direct democracy by getting all citizens physically into the marketplace to cast their ballots. Now you can have a virtual marketplace online. Now, I don't think everybody really wants to vote on every detail of the pipelines under the North Sea bill, but you can see why there is that greater appetite for people to say, well, we think we should be consulted on the really big issues. Add into that the fact that, as Jean-Claude Juncker said the other day, the European Union has, not on everything, but on some things, simply tried to interfere too much in how a very diverse group of member states go about their affairs. And sometimes it is the really minor but symbolic issues that hit the headlines. And that ridiculous proposal 2 or 3 years ago to ban restaurants and cafes from putting out olive oil in their own jugs or dipping plates. I mean, just who on earth dreamt that up? I mean, you really do wonder about people's sanity sometimes. But then the other issues have crept in. Undoubtedly, immigration has had a big impact on politics in the UK, as here in Sweden. Slightly different reasons, but and more than half our immigration is from non-EU countries. But the Labour government in 2004 predicted that there would be about 13,000 people from Central Europe, from the new member states, who are coming to Britain as a result of us not introducing transitional controls. The figures in practice were more than 1 million. And so it was not simply that there were large numbers, which, as you will know from your own experience here, just create some difficulties in terms of management, how you integrate very large numbers of people into your society in a short space of time. Pressure on public services in particular locations. But also that sense that, amongst the public, that we were not told the truth. No, you can argue, I don't think it was a deliberate untruth by the then government, but they got the figures badly wrong. And the ministers of that time will say, yes, we got the figures wrong. And so that added to the mistrust. And immigration is still, in all our opinion polls, the most important single political issue on people's minds at the moment. But then there's a broader issue. The opinion research, not just in Britain, but around the whole of Europe, is showing disaffection with conventional ways of doing politics, including ways in which politics is done at EU level. And if you look at Eurobarometer, or if you look at Pew Research, you will see this is not just a British issue. I've seen poll findings that show mistrust of the EU and its decision-making greater in France and Spain than in the UK. Or if you look at the rise of populist movements and parties of both left and right in many different European countries. Now, whether it's the parties left, the Podemos and the Syriza and Five Star Movement, or whether it's Front National or Sweden Democrats or Jobbik or now Alternative, there is a pattern which is of public frustration, to some extent alienation from traditional ways of political decision-taking, and that feeling strongest amongst those people in society who feel most at risk from globalization and economic and social change, the same phenomenon that I think is behind Donald Trump's rise in the United States. So you have this is happening in terms of public attitudes, and what you see in the UK is one symptom of that. And in the UK, you set that against the background of a geography and a history which makes our experience different from that of most of the rest of the continent. I think in Sweden you probably can understand this better than some other European countries do. It's not just Ireland, but it's the fact that in the mid-20th century, what most of Europe experienced was the catastrophic failure of national institutions, national solidarity, national identity. You had dictatorships, warfare, invasions, ethnic cleansing, exterminations on the most appalling, brutal scale, and continuing even after 1945 for a couple of years with millions of displaced people around Europe and very weak governance in much of Europe. For us, the same period of history was the vindication of national institutions, national solidarity, national identity. That is what held us together in the face of Nazis. And so the different historical perspectives, I think, help to explain why there is never going to be an emotional commitment to the ideal of European integration as something that is good in its own right in Britain, that you will see most obviously in Germany, but you will see in much of the rest of the continent as well. And one of the things I argue when I go around Europe is that we need to be better at understanding the historical experience and therefore the attitudes of our partners who've gone through that nightmare. Equally, they need to understand why we don't think that way ourselves and just respect the fact that there are those different experiences and therefore different attitudes today. Now, where does that all take us? It takes us to a situation in which I believe, not just for the sake of a British referendum on the 23rd of June, but for the sake of the unity and solidarity of Europe as a whole, that the EU needs to demonstrate that it is serious and determined about addressing the challenges that face the whole of the continent and where cooperative, collective European action will make a difference for the better for the people that we represent. Now, in the British context, I think that what David Cameron achieved in February was a very important step forward. I think that getting the reassurance that we are not going to be forced against our will into some sort of political union, that as our colleagues in the Eurozone integrate more closely together, as I believe they will need to do because of the dynamic inherent in a currency union, that it must be done in a way that does not prejudice a single market at 28 or discriminate against those of us who remain outside the euro area. Those are really important steps forward. But I think that just getting the right result on the 23rd is not is not of itself going to be enough to address what I've briefly tried to describe as a European phenomenon. Actually, Carl Bildt said to me a couple of years ago, please go and tell Mr. Farage that he is part of a European phenomenon. There's this sort of move to populism around Europe, a protest around Europe. And so I think that if we look forward, and we're thinking forward 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, what is Europe going to look like? What are the things that need to be done that actually win back public support? Well, I think one, as I've indicated a moment ago, is that Europe has to recognise that it is a much more diverse place today than it was with the original 6 in the 1950s. And if in the next 10 years we're admitting some more of the Western Balkans countries, it'll be more diverse still. And you cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach in those circumstances. So I think that, in particular, recognising that there's going to be a difference between those who are in and out of the single currency, that you have to have a system for managing the relationship of a Europe at 28 and a Europe of 19, is one important step forward. The recognition in the February European Council conclusions that more needs to be done to make a reality of subsidiarity and make it something more than a piece of doctrine to which lip service only is paid needs to be an animating factor in Europe as a whole. But I think as important as sort of getting that institutional culture right is a focus upon the massive challenges, economic and political, that the whole of Europe faces today. Challenges where I believe that the United Kingdom can play a very energetic, very constructive and a very important role in helping to shape and lead our answers. Let me start with the economic challenge. It is already proving very difficult indeed for many European countries to pull themselves out of the depression that began in 2008 and which laid bare the foolishness of some of the silly borrowing and the silly lending by both governments and private sector organisations that had happened in the years previously. And we see, particularly in southern Europe, appallingly high levels of unemployment, especially amongst young people. And we see in Central Europe too few opportunities for employment, which has prompted large-scale movement in the search for work. Now, we're lucky. I mean, we know, and well, I would say it's more than luck. I'd say it's through good policy. You know, we have record numbers of people in work, and I've noted that the growth rate here in Sweden is now about 4.5%, and it's by European standards today at a high level, and that's welcome. But frankly speaking, if in 5 years' time, let alone 10 years' time, we are looking at levels of unemployment, particularly among young people, that resemble or are even worse than they are today, then the support for the Marine Le Pens and the Golden Dawns at that time is going to dwarf what we already see now. And the problem for Europe is that recovery from the crash would be challenging enough in its own right. But we're having to do that while at the same time facing two economic challenges, each of which would be existential in its own right. The first is that of global competition, with Asian and Latin American countries increasingly willing and able to challenge us on our own territory. They're not happy with just doing the low-paid, low-skilled work. They want to take us on in competition to provide goods and services that we thought were the province of the developed economies alone to produce and sell around the world. And then on top of that, we have digital technology that is starting now to shake up professional and white-collar work as dramatically as automation transformed factory floor working a generation ago. And I'm starting to read reports of how paralegal work, how some elements of accountancy work, even some elements of journalism, will be done by algorithms in the future rather than by people. And that will add to the sense of uncertainty and uncertainty of expectation in the minds of many citizens. So how do we respond to those challenges? Now, there's a lot, obviously, that national governments need to do and take responsibility for, but there are things that can be done at European level to respond to those challenges. The first is to create a continental scale market in digital and services in the way that is already available to Americans, to American businesses, large and small. We have a very well-functioning European single market when it comes to the trade in goods, but a badly undeveloped single market when it comes to trade in services, although it is from services that most of the new jobs and the new growth are going to come, and where increasingly with high-value advanced manufacturing, companies are going out and selling to their consumers packages of goods and services so that you will sell parts or components along with the guarantee that you will provide the service to keep those in good order and well maintained. So, liberalisation of services, a single market in digital, I'd add a single market in energy, are absolutely key to getting Europe's economic dynamism back. And the UK and Sweden have always, under whatever governments have been in power, they've tended to be very close allies on that agenda. And we need to really persist with that. We need to persist too, because it complements the work on the single market, with work on smarter regulation. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to stand here. No British politician is going to get up and say that, we should be sending little boys up chimneys to clean them. But there are still, rules and regulations which, particularly for small businesses that cannot afford to employ a department of people to keep track of new regulations, which are not necessary to provide the safeguards that in a civilised society we rightly expect to be observed. And so the inclusion in the February conclusions of a commitment to a quantitative regulatory targets, to introduce the concept of regulatory budgeting into how the EU works the first time, was good. So too was the commitment to create a subsidiarity mechanism to look retrospectively at the acquis to see whether everything really still needed to be done at European level or whether some things might sensibly be sent back to member state level. And I would add, because I think it's right for me to say this on the record, that having been, shall I say, a little bit sceptical of Mr. Juncker when he was appointed President of the Commission, I think that the way in which the Commission has acted on this regulatory agenda has been very welcome. I think that Juncker and Timmermans, in hacking back dramatically the number of new legislative initiatives, has demonstrated that they do understand the gravity of the economic challenge that European business is facing. And I've said to both of them, I know that's very welcome, the steps that they have been taking. So that's single market work. I'd throw in Jonathan Hill's work on Capital Markets Union to give small businesses more access to capital. There's a whole range of sensible European initiatives that could help make a positive difference. Single market regulation, the third element of this is trade. Because yes, Mexico, China, India, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia, they are all challenges. They're competition, but they're also opportunities. Those countries are now giving rise to tens of millions of new consumers with the purchasing power to buy our goods and our services. And we should be seeing this as an opportunity. But that then means that we have to use the leverage of the biggest marketplace in the world, the negotiating bloc of 500 million people, to prise open those markets and ensure that we are able to sell into them. Our firms can sell into them. Again, this is something where the UK and Sweden, not to mention Commissioner Malmström at the moment, have been playing an incredibly active role. I saw for myself how Prime Minister Cameron intervened in the final stages of the agreement with Korea to get that over the line. We're doing all we can at the moment on Canada with the same objective. The big prize is the agreement TTIP with the United States because, yes, I mean, part of it's about reducing tariffs, and the tariffs are pretty low already across the Atlantic, but on some things, some vehicles, on certain items of clothing, electrical goods, they still matter, and their abolition would make a difference. But the real gain would be through mutual recognition or approximation of regulatory standards. The vehicle manufacturer would no longer have to apply slightly different standards in production lines selling to the different sides of the Atlantic. I mean, the outcomes are pretty much the same anyway, but it's just we have this silly business of two different technical standards. And that would cut their cut their costs by having a single production line, and then which leads to cheaper vehicles to consumers, whether purchasers of vans and lorries or purchasers of family cars. And in effect, what that would be doing was establishing global regulatory standards on a transatlantic basis. And I think the alternative is not just status quo. I think the alternative is we'll wake up in a few years' time and find the Asian powers have put something together, and Europe is in the rather humiliating position of having to scurry after them and copy what they have done. So there is a massive economic agenda for us to pursue on the single market, on regulation and on trade. But there are, I'm keeping an eye on the clock, there are serious political challenges also, and I want to touch just on three. The first is that globalization brings opportunities, and we think about globalization in terms primarily of the economy. But globalization is also something that is happening to crime. When I talk to senior police officers or to intelligence agency chiefs in London, they say to me that almost all serious crime now has a transnational dimension to it. It is most obvious when it comes to terrorism, but it's true obviously also of drug trafficking, of people trafficking and people smuggling, of organised robbery and fraud, including internet fraud, and even sex crimes, where we found the reason we decided to opt into the Prüm directive was that we ran a pilot project, and we found that we were picking up people like child abusers, and someone was tested for DNA in the UK, and we suddenly found when we compared the data that they were cropping up in 2 or 3 other European countries as well. There was a pattern that we were able to establish with offenders networking across different jurisdictions within Europe. Now again, different legal systems, they vary from country to country, and I wouldn't be pushing for, I certainly would not support a single police or criminal justice system across Europe, but I do think that cooperative work on policing and criminal justice is really important. The European arrest warrant has meant that in the UK we have been able to send back about 7,000 people to other jurisdictions to face justice there, and we have been able to get back to Britain about 1,000 people that we wanted to stand trial or to serve a sentence for serious crimes. And those included one of the men who was guilty of the second London tube bombing attempt in 2005. It used to take years to extradite people. It now can be done in a matter of weeks or months under the European arrest warrant. Prüm I've mentioned, but the information sharing that is now going on between police forces is absolutely vital to effective action against criminals and terrorists who operate across national frontiers and stopping them from doing it with impunity. And we do need to do more. I mean, what we are pressing for at European level now, particularly after the Brussels attacks, is action for stricter rules on the registration and ownership of firearms, for more work to be done on information sharing, because there is still there's still some problems and wrinkles in the system, and for rapid implementation of what was finally voted through by the European Parliament last week, a proper system of passenger name records, so that we don't lose track of people when they get on an aircraft and fly to a different jurisdiction. So there's some important benefits from effective European cooperation on criminal justice matters. The second political challenge is that which comes from a newly aggressive and truculent Russia. Now, I don't want to rehearse, blow by blow what's happened in Ukraine, but I would just say this. I think that pretty well all of us had worked for 20 years and more on the basis that Russia, since Gorbachev's time, was slowly moving towards integration into a rules-based international order. That Russia, even under Brezhnev, had accepted the principles of Helsinki. We supported Russia coming into the World Trade Organization, the OECD. G7 was expanded to G8. They were on their way. It wasn't perfect, but they were moving gradually in the right direction. And if I look back, I think collectively we did not heed the warning signs in Georgia in 2008. We thought that was an aberration. Let it de-escalate. And the annexation of Crimea came as a real shock. And what the annexation of Crimea was the first attempt by force by one European country to rewrite European borders since 1945. It was the most flagrant breach of the Helsinki Final Act and of subsequent treaties, including those between Russia and Ukraine at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And we've seen since then the interference in the Donbass. We've seen the propaganda war that's been going on, the intimidation of the Baltic states, the testing of Swedish territorial waters, the testing of UK air defences, and an assertion by Russia that they have the right to intervene in support of Russian speakers and Russian citizens anywhere. The murder of Litvinenko in London, the abduction of Kova from Estonia, the abduction of several Ukrainian citizens, not just Nadia Savchenko, it's Sentsov and others who have been taken illegally to Russia and put on trial there. And I would like to think that Russia was in the business of being a strategic partner, but I think the evidence is that the Kremlin has decided to treat Europe as a strategic adversary, and to do that at a time when the US has been focused more on the Pacific than on Europe. And so I think European solidarity is absolutely critical in the face of that challenge. NATO remains the key element in our defence and security. But the EU has an important part to play when we are talking about a hybrid capability on the part of the Kremlin. So if we're looking at reducing European dependence upon Russian energy supplies, if we're looking at European resilience against potential cyber attacks, if we're looking at strategic communications and how to counter the propaganda effort that is being mounted both through Russian language media in parts of the Baltics, Georgia, Ukraine, but also through Russia Today and other very effective means in Western news networks, then that is something that falls within the EU's province as well. And I think the UK has an important and positive role to play in developing and strengthening that agenda, not least in making sure that the European and the American positions are aligned, as we've done successfully so far over Ukraine sanctions. And third, we've seen the collapse of governance in parts of Africa and the Middle East, something that has prompted a humanitarian tragedy and which has been one, not the only cause, but one of the causes of the mass movement of people that we have seen from those parts of the world. Now, I think that there are other causes, that sort of economic underperformance, climate change, demographics, and so on, that mean that those pressures will remain, even if we can bring an end to the war in Syria and help the GNA get a grip on the situation in Libya. But that state collapse is something, again, which is happening in the European neighbourhood and to which European countries need to respond effectively and coherently. And I think the United States is making it pretty clear that they are expecting European nations to take up more of the burden of dealing with these issues. The US pays for 70% of NATO's costs at the moment. They are increasingly, I think, focused on China and the Pacific. And I don't think we can simply assume that somebody else is going to come in and sort out these challenges for us. And we talk a lot about the comprehensive approach of the European Union, but too often that comprehensive approach exists more in theory than in practice. You still get turf wars between the External Action Service and the European Commission. You still find we have highfalutin conclusions and not enough follow-up and implementation. And I think we really need to step up a gear in how we do business as regards these crises. And Turkey is that the Aegean crisis is the first big test of this, but Libya is the next one, which is already facing us. But the model is there. There is immediate humanitarian help. The sort of 11, 12 billion euro that was pledged to humanitarian support in Syria and the region in the London conference recently. Well, that needs to be delivered. And then we need to ensure that the money is properly and effectively spent, helping people in the region with opportunities for education and work, as well as immediate humanitarian food and medical support. We need to make sure that action is taken to strengthen Europe's external borders, which is why the UK is putting money and people into Frontex and ESO, even though we're outside Schengen, in order to boost the capacity of the Greeks to handle this crisis with which they're struggling. We need to be willing to use CSDP missions, as has happened in Somalia and the Central African Republic and in Mali, and which may be necessary in Libya. The Foreign Affairs Council opened the door to that on Monday evening. It means that we've got to focus on the long term, not just the short term, to address the causes of large-scale movement and of political instability. And that means action using development aid, both to encourage economic opportunity, but also to support better governance in a country so that it is more likely to attract inward investment and trade. And it means that we need to be looking at opening up opportunities for some of these developing countries to sell more and more freely into European markets. And, it means we have to be more willing, perhaps, to accept their fruit and vegetables, if that is going to help give the people of those countries the hope that they can have a decent life and their children's ambitions can be fulfilled without packing up and leaving and putting themselves in the hands of the people smugglers. So there's a huge agenda that I think faces Europe over a generation. It's not just a 12-month period, to deal with what this combination of political crisis, economic underperformance, the universal availability of smartphones and the information that gives about how life is better elsewhere, and the professionalisation of people smugglers is now doing in driving this mass movement of people. Now, in all of these challenges, whether you look at the economic or the political ones, I think the UK has an absolutely key role and should be playing a leading role. And I'm just going to finish on this point by going back to the referendum. And the line that my Prime Minister keeps pushing, his sort of top line in the referendum debate, is that the UK will be stronger, safer and better off through continued EU membership. Yes, there are alternatives. You could be like Norway, you could be like Switzerland, you could be like Korea and have a free trade agreement, you could be like Zimbabwe and rely on the World Trade Organization rules. None of them give us all the benefits and the place at the table making the decisions that membership provides. And it is very striking that if you look at the people in the Out campaign, they cannot come up with a coherent account of what Out looks like. Some say Canada, some say Switzerland, some say Norway, some say several of those during the course of different weeks. And I think that indicates that they are struggling to articulate what that alternative looks like. But I think also we on the Remain side of the argument have to put forward the argument to not just, and this is an important argument, not just that we would be taking massive risks with our prosperity and our security and our ability to protect ourselves against crime and terrorism if we were to leave and do damage to the rest of Europe in the process, but that if we remain in and seek to lead in shaping the right answers to the challenges that I have tried briefly to describe this morning, then we can expect to play that leading role that I think the British people would expect us to do. It's not the same thing as taking part in some super-state project, some United States of Europe. It is about leading and shaping a cooperative endeavour, a habit of working together to resolve problems that are too big for any of us, for Britain, for Germany, for France, for Sweden, to fix on our own. And I hope that when we get to the 24th of June this year, that is the work that the Cameron government will be redoubling its efforts on, and where we, working with you and other like-minded countries, will be able to find those answers, and in finding those answers, give the reassurance to those millions of disaffected people around European countries that actually this organisation has learnt some lessons. It is focusing on the challenges that matter, and it is providing answers that are coherent, that are effective, and going to give people that promise of a safer and more prosperous life, which is what they want for themselves and their families. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much. If you wish to
yeah, sure. That's fine. I didn't use that.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving the positive scenario to the UK and the world if the UK stays in the EU. We've heard a lot about the bad things that can happen if there is a Brexit, and I really appreciated hearing sort of your view on the good things that can happen if you stay. There have been a number of reports out in the last couple of months on the consequences of the UK leaving the EU, on what different kinds of trading arrangements. And there was one, I think, 2 days ago from the Treasury on the costs for an average UK household or in terms of GDP. And there were very high numbers done by economists at the Treasury. Could you, we don't have very much time, but could you briefly comment on sort of the results of these very well-written reports that have been published the last couple of months on the alternative of the referendum coming to the conclusion that Britain should leave the EU?
Yeah, I mean the Treasury. What the Treasury did was to try to model the economic impact of a British exit, leaving all other variables the same. So they basically took the existing forecasts of what was going to happen in the British economy, British migration, growth rates, employment and so on. Say, right, let's take all those as a given, not fiddle with those, and then adjust for EU membership and what we think would happen. And it was showing a significantly lower growth rate. It was showing, I think the figure was £4,300 drop in average family incomes. It was what they were forecasting was a big economic blow. Now you can quibble about particular assumptions in that particular report, but I think what is really striking is how what the Treasury was coming up with is broadly the same analysis as what the IMF has come up with. It's broadly the same analysis as what the Bank of England has come up with. It's broadly the same analysis that the forecasters for the big City of London institutions are coming up with in the private sector. There is actually an overwhelming consensus that the consequence would be economic shock and dislocation. And this is just UK. I mean, I think it would have an impact on the rest of Europe too. And it would certainly shake business confidence. There's an impact then on your GDP, therefore on the ability of government to spend, probably on, therefore, the amount of money you can spend on public services. So you will find some who dissent, but it is what I find striking is that the consensus is so overwhelming among the serious institutions.
Yeah, and I felt when I read it that even if there's not a referendum, more countries in Europe should publish reports like that to sort of show their voters what this really produces, because it is really striking. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to give you one example. I know that the City of London is really worried about what an exit would mean, because something like a third of London financial services business is done elsewhere in Europe, and it relies very much on the passport for a business located in London to be able to sell anywhere in the single market at 28. We leave then, all of that is up for renegotiation under the Article 50 arrangements, and I know people in Paris and Frankfurt who would be only too glad to find a way of getting a slice of that. So you have that. I think that some of the other international manufacturers and service companies that use the UK as their European base for selling to the single market as a whole, I mean, they won't. I'm not arguing they're going to all close their doors the day afterwards, but they've said to me it will just become increasingly difficult to justify to a head office in Beijing or Mumbai or Tokyo or Los Angeles that we should put R&D or new investment into London or Newcastle or Bristol rather than into the Czech Republic or into Spain, because we would worry about that single market access. So I think it would be an erosion of our share of foreign direct investment and of business over time. Okay, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Håkan Jonsson from the Halverson and Halverson Consultancy. I think it's safe to say that most people here hope for a yes in the a stay vote in the referendum. And I don't want to spoil the party by asking if a yes and stay vote could also be having political repercussions that would be negative. I'm thinking of the possibility of a yes, very narrow yes vote with a very low turnout, or a narrow yes vote combined with a divisive pattern like countryside and elderly and uneducated voting no, or voting out, and big city, high educated, younger persons voting in. Or a devolutionary scenario where you have England voting no and Scotland and the Northern Ireland voting yes.
Yeah, I mean there are clearly those risks. I think that if the vote is to stay, that most people will accept that. I would be more worried about the constitutional impact of a narrow vote to leave, with Scotland and Northern Ireland both voting to stay, as they are predicted to do decisively. If you look at the British polls, there is a correlation between age and how people vote. The younger age groups lean heavily towards Remain. Old people are the ones who are leaning towards Leave. There's a similar correlation over education and skills. I talked about, if you like, it's the people, the threatened white working class who are the ones who are most likely to vote to leave. University graduates overwhelmingly for stay. Geographically, Scotland, London, Northern Ireland definitely remain. Regional England, it varies. East Midlands, probably the strongest for leaving. So there's a whole range of different factors that are in play. But I think that you see, don't forget that Europe, as an issue in its own right, does not come in the top group of political questions when people are asked which issue matters most to you and your family or matters most to the country. It's normally sort of between 7 and 10 in the ranking order. The top is, I say, it's been immigration for over a year. Immigration, the economy, health, and then you will have education, usually terrorism and crime. And then you might have something like pensions, taxing. Europe comes down sort of somewhere with the environment. It's sort of quite a low priority for most people. And that's why the Out campaign is focusing on immigration as their key argument, because they know that is something that is in people's minds. Might the referendum move the Europe issue higher on people's list? Yes, and it's doing that. It is doing that already. Oh. But I think that if we get an answer that's clear, I think that there is that outside those who are the absolutely committed leavers, I don't think that there would be a huge, long-running sort of a battle over this. Still, I think most people then accept that and get on. Yeah, please.
I'm Lars Anell from Arena, the think tank. I don't want to spoil the party either, but I may. 2 points. One is that if I was in Scotland and if I really wanted Scottish independence, I might actually think twice about how I would vote in this referendum. The second point is that, and I appreciate very much that you actually discuss the challenges of the European Union, and I think that you would find broad agreement about your agenda for what we would like the European Union to become in the future. And I agree very much that subsidiarity has been a joke, and it shouldn't be, because it should be a really main principle. But how certain can we be, you and I, that this is the kind of European Union we will have in the future? And that leaves you actually with a problem, as I see it, because you said, and we agree, that it's very difficult for those voting for Britain to leave. What kind of Britain would that be? What kind of situation would you be in? But your problem is that you are campaigning to stay in a union that you don't like. And that means that you need to convince people, don't you, that we will be able actually to provide some kind of leadership together with Sweden and other countries to form a better union in the future, because the one that we have is something that you don't really like. Isn't that true?
Pardon, would you like to? We're running out of time, and Mia wants to ask a question. If there is any more, we sort of take the questions we have, and then you can choose which ones you want to answer. That makes life much easier for you. Mia. Of course, 5 past we have.
Yes, actually, this was a follow-up to Lars.
And you don't want to spoil the party either.
No, I would like to have this more longer-term reflection on what would happen to the European Union in your views, if there's a stay or if there is a going out of the EU from in the referendum. There would be. So it's a follow-up of Lars.
We don't have any small questions today for 5 minutes. There's one more question over there. And then you can choose how to.
Thanks. Hans Delmo, Swedish Central Bank. Well, if a party is spoiled on the 23rd, and what is the most likely scenario then? Would it be a member of the EEA like Norway? And a follow-up to that, if that would be the case, is there any reason to believe that you would get more generous terms than, for example, Norway?
Exactly.
On the one hand, now, you could say UK is a more important trading partner. On the other hand, EU's main aim must be to hold the union together. And they don't want to convey the message that it's costless to leave the European Union. So I would like to hear your view about that. And what does the proponents of Brexit say about this?
Okay, in 5 minutes, I sort of...
Okay, right. I mean, do Lars first. You could construct that Machiavellian argument for Scotland. The Scottish National Party has been very firm in saying that they're campaigning strongly for a Remain vote. And I think if you want to look at it from a Machiavellian point of view, what they want is Scottish independence, but also membership of the EU. That would be extraordinarily difficult for Scotland in any circumstances, because you've got countries like Spain that would be deeply opposed to the idea that you could have successful separation and continued EU membership, because of the precedent that would set. But if the Scottish nationalists had played the key role in bringing about a UK exit, they could expect even less sympathy for their ambitions to get in as an independent country. But the First Minister of Scotland has said that in the event of a vote to leave, with Scotland voting to stay, she would then press for a second referendum on Scottish independence. So there would be some constitutional turbulence. You're in a way. I mean, I'm not saying I dislike the EU, but there's a lot about it that is imperfect. But the British, for the historical reasons I was outlining at the beginning, the British are always going to look at this in a pragmatic way. There are lots of organisations that we're part of that are a long way from being perfect, but you don't actually usually make life better by walking out of the door and slamming it behind you. You think long and hard before you leave a marriage that's going through a bumpy patch and go through the trauma of a divorce proceeding. So I think that you put the argument sensibly and pragmatically about advantage and opportunity and national interest, economic and political. Those arguments get through. On Maria's questions of what happens to the EU in the event of a British departure, I think it would become more protectionist and inward-looking if our votes and our voice are away from the table. I think that you would probably get a push from Brussels and from some national capitals for a big move towards increased integration to try to avoid further fragmentation. And the problem with that is that then runs up against the public disaffection I talked about, the Le Pens, the Syrizas, the Jobbiks, the Alternative, and so on. So, and I don't know how that would play out, but there'd be some risks there. I think that without us, Europe would be less robust in facing Putin, and I think Putin would look for opportunities to exploit that. And I think we'd be certain to be more ineffective in dealing with the migration crisis. Simply, if we're looking inwards and dealing with a British exit negotiation, that's going to take up a huge amount of political energy. What happens? The government's view is very clear. I mean, the EEA, it's one of the options, but you're absolutely right. I don't see why. Why on earth should we expect that we would get a better deal? I mean, what I find so why I find the Leave campaign to be so it's a politics of fairyland what they come up with, because they're saying, on the one hand, if we stay in, these other countries are always going to be plotting against us to do us down. But if only we leave, these same countries are going to rush to give us all the things we like about EU membership, the free trade, the single market, and so on, and none of the obligations at all. I mean, that is utter fantasy. And if you're in the European Economic Area, it is an option. But if you're in the European Economic Area, it means you pay into the EU budget. It means you accept freedom of movement of workers. It means that you accept all the rules of the single market. The difference being that you're not at the table when the rules are made. You have no vote, no say in how they are made. And, whenever I've talked to Norwegian ministers, they'd say you'll be absolutely crazy to try and swap your position for ours. And going back to last, what would it be like? I mean, we have to push for the changes, and the reason that we did a lot of what our focus was on in February was on institutional changes, not just a list of directives to be repealed or changed, is that you've got to get institutional change in order to change the political culture of the EU. And that will be work which will need continuing effort, I think. We'll have to make sure the February agreement is implemented properly, and we'll need to work with other like-minded countries to make sure that the checks and balances are properly applied.
Minister, you made it in 5 minutes. Thank you very much for coming here a second time. Second time is almost a tradition, so maybe we can see you here a third time. You never know. Thank you very much.
Thank you.